It was a quiet afternoon in the small town where everyone knew each other. In this tight-knit community, Deputy Sheriff's daughter, Emily, had always felt proud of her father's work. Growing up, she admired the badge he wore and the way people respected him. To her, the town felt like a safe, peaceful place. The streets were familiar, and the faces around her were kind. But there were moments when Emily felt uneasy about things she didn't fully understand. That afternoon, on her way home from the store, Emily found herself walking down a street she didn't often take. It wasn't a dangerous area, but the street was quieter than usual. As she passed a small alley, she spotted a man standing near the corner. At first glance, he seemed to be lost in thought, his back turned toward her. There was something about him that made her nervous, but she couldn't quite figure out why. Her mind raced as she quickly walked by, hoping to avoid any trouble. As she passed, she heard him call out. She didn't stop at first, but then she heard it again, louder this time. "Hey!" She paused, glancing over her shoulder. The man's voice was firm, but not angry. Something about his presence made her feel uncomfortable, even though she hadn't spoken to him yet. He stepped forward, and Emily instinctively felt a sense of danger. Her heart started to beat faster, and her mind filled with thoughts she didn't want to have. Without thinking, Emily turned around and hurried back toward the main street. Her anxiety grew, and before she knew it, she pulled out her phone. In a state of panic, she dialed the sheriff's office and spoke quickly, her words jumbling together. "There's a man. He looks suspicious. He's near the alley off Oak Street. He's following me." Her voice trembled as she gave her location, her fear making it hard to stay calm. She hung up the phone, but her heart was still racing. She waited, her eyes nervously scanning the street ahead. Then, from behind, she heard the sound of footsteps. When she turned, she saw the man had followed her and was walking toward her, still a few yards away. Fear gripped her chest. The man's presence only seemed to grow more threatening in her mind. In a state of panic, Emily took a few steps back, clutching her phone tightly in her hand. She called out, "Stay back. I'm calling the police." But the man didn't stop. He just kept walking slowly, his expression unreadable. The street was nearly empty, and her voice seemed to fade into the quiet air around them. Minutes later, the sheriff's deputies arrived. They moved quickly, their sirens cutting through the silence of the neighborhood. Emily felt relief wash over her as she saw the familiar faces of the officers. They quickly approached the man, and Emily couldn't help but watch, still unsure of what was going on. As the officers surrounded him, Emily felt a sudden, strange pang of guilt. She had accused this man without fully knowing who he was or what his intentions had been. Then, to her surprise, the man spoke calmly to the officers, his tone respectful but firm. "I'm the Attorney General," he said, his voice carrying authority. Emily blinked, stunned, as the man identified himself. She had no idea who he was. The reality of the situation suddenly hit her. She had just accused a person of something serious, and now it seemed she had made a grave mistake. She stood frozen in place, unable to speak, her heart sinking in her chest. As the realization hit Emily, she stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. The man she had accused, the man who seemed so ordinary at first glance, was not just anyone. He was the Attorney General, a figure she had only heard about in the news or on the television. She felt the weight of her actions sink in deeper, her face flushing with embarrassment. Her heart, which had been racing out of fear only moments ago, now felt heavy with guilt. The deputies were already speaking to the man, asking him questions in a respectful manner. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Emily's panic. The officers seemed to take his word for it without hesitation, and Emily could hear one of them murmuring apologies to him. She felt like a small child caught in a mistake too big to undo. She wanted to explain, to apologize, but her voice wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there, her hands trembling at her sides. The Attorney General looked at Emily then, his gaze steady and calm. It was hard to read his expression, but there was no anger in his eyes, only the quiet understanding that Emily's mistake wasn't personal, but rather a result of a fearful assumption. Still, she couldn't help but feel the sting of the situation. How could she have been so quick to judge him based on nothing but fear? How could she have let her mind race to such conclusions without knowing the facts? As the officers finished their brief conversation with him, the Attorney General stepped closer to Emily. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. But there was a seriousness in his tone when he spoke. "I understand your concern," he said gently, his voice calm and composed. "But I would suggest you take a moment to reflect on why you felt that way. Fear is a powerful thing, but we should never let it cloud our judgment." Emily could only nod. She couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come. Her mind was still reeling. The man she had accused, a person of such importance, was here offering her understanding instead of punishment. It felt surreal. "Are you okay?" one of the deputies asked Emily, noticing her pale face. She didn't answer right away, still processing everything in her head. The officers had already begun to apologize to the Attorney General, and Emily's heart sank even further. She didn't want him to feel like he had to accept the apology of others when it was she who had made the mistake. The Attorney General turned his attention back to her, his voice now softer. "Don't worry," he said, though it felt strange to hear him comforting her when it was she who had caused the issue. "Mistakes happen. What matters is that you learn from this." Emily couldn't believe how calm he was. The man she had accused was showing her kindness and understanding, even though she had made a serious error in judgment. He could have been angry. He could have demanded justice or pressed charges. But instead, he chose to teach her a lesson in humility and awareness. As the moments passed, Emily's guilt began to settle into something else, a quiet determination to make things right. She knew that this was a turning point, not just in how she saw others, but in how she saw herself. She needed to confront her own biases, her own assumptions, and face the reality that her fear had led her to make an unjust accusation. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how often fear shaped her decisions without her even knowing. The Attorney General gave her one last nod before turning to leave, his voice carrying one final piece of advice. "Take care," he said. "And remember, we are all more than what we appear to be on the surface." As he walked away, Emily stood frozen, her mind racing with the lesson she had just learned. It was a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Emily stood there, trying to steady her racing heart. The weight of her mistake was still heavy, but there was no way to undo what had happened. She couldn't believe how quickly things had spiraled. In her small town, things like this didn't usually happen. People knew each other, and they trusted each other. But now, the trust she had always taken for granted felt shattered. As she walked back to her car, her mind was a swirl of emotions. She couldn't stop thinking about the Attorney General. The way he had spoken to her, so calm and understanding, seemed almost too good to be true. She had expected anger, or at the very least, some kind of punishment. Instead, he had shown her compassion and offered her wisdom without making her feel worse than she already did. It was a stark contrast to the way she had reacted, and it left her questioning everything she thought she knew about herself. Back at home, things didn't feel any better. When Emily walked through the door, she was met with the sound of her father's voice in the living room. He was talking to her mother about something, but as soon as Emily entered, the conversation stopped. Both her parents turned to her, and she could see the concern on their faces. "What happened, Em?" her father asked, his voice laced with worry. Emily took a deep breath. Her father had always been her hero. He was the deputy sheriff, the man who kept the town safe. She had looked up to him her whole life. She knew he expected her to follow the right path, to make wise decisions. And now, she had messed up. I made a mistake," Emily said softly. She felt the weight of her words as they hung in the air. Her father raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Emily went on to explain the entire situation, the fear she had felt, how she had seen the man as a threat, and how she had called the authorities. When she told them that the man had revealed himself to be the Attorney General, her father's face changed. There was a moment of stunned silence. Her mother, always the more emotional one, looked at her with concern. "Do you understand how serious this is?" she asked. "What if he decides to press charges?" Emily nodded, her heart sinking. "I know. I messed up. I didn't know who he was, but I still acted on fear." Her father, after a long pause, sighed. "You made a mistake, but what matters now is how you handle it. No one's perfect, but you've got to learn from this." His words, though calm, struck Emily deeply. She had always wanted to make her father proud, and now she had disappointed him. She could see it in his eyes, even though he was trying to remain composed. "But Dad, what if I never get a chance to make it right?" Emily asked quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "What if everyone in town thinks I'm just some scared girl who made a foolish mistake?" Her father stood up and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "People make mistakes, Emily. The important thing is to acknowledge it and learn from it. You've got to own your actions, no matter how hard it is." "I don't know how," Emily whispered. "You'll figure it out," he said, "and you'll be better for it." Her mother, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. "We're proud of you, Em. No one is saying you're a bad person, but this is a lesson. A hard one, but one you'll never forget." Emily nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. She knew her parents were right, but the embarrassment she felt seemed to wrap itself around her like a thick fog. The town, her father's colleagues, and even the Attorney General would all remember what had happened. She wasn't sure how she could ever move past it. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she kept thinking about the Attorney General's calm words. "We are all more than what we appear to be on the surface." Those words echoed in her mind, and she began to understand their meaning. Fear had caused her to judge a person without truly knowing him, without seeing beyond the surface of his appearance. It had been easy to make assumptions based on her own fears, but she knew now that this mistake was not just about one person. It was about how she viewed the world. It would take time to make things right, but Emily had a new understanding now. She had learned that assumptions, especially those based on fear, could lead to painful consequences. And though it hurt to admit, she knew she had a lot of work ahead of her. But this was her chance to grow, and she wasn't going to waste it. The following days were difficult for Emily. Her mind kept replaying the incident with the Attorney General, and she couldn't seem to shake the feeling of embarrassment that clung to her. Every time she went out, it felt as if everyone in town was watching her, whispering behind her back. The small town that had always felt so familiar now felt like a place where she no longer belonged. At work, her colleagues were kind, but there was a new distance between them. They were polite but cautious, as though they were unsure how to approach her. Emily's father, too, seemed to be treating her with a little more reserve, though he was still offering his quiet support. It wasn't the same, though. The comfortable bond they had shared felt strained, as though an invisible wall had been built between them. But as the days passed, Emily couldn't help but think about the Attorney General and the conversation they had. His calm and understanding presence had stayed with her. Instead of being angry or seeking revenge, he had chosen a more compassionate path. He could have easily made the situation more difficult for her, but he hadn't. Instead, he had used the moment to teach her something important, something she would never forget. One afternoon, while Emily was sitting in the park, lost in thought, she noticed a figure approaching. She recognized the man immediately. The Attorney General. He was walking slowly, as though he were enjoying the fresh air, but when he saw her, he stopped and smiled politely. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure what to say. She had expected him to avoid her after what had happened, but here he was, approaching her with no sign of anger or resentment. "Good afternoon, Emily," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "Good afternoon, sir," she replied quietly, looking down at the ground. She wasn't sure how to continue the conversation, But he spoke again before the silence could settle in. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "I know the past few days have been difficult, but I hope you're doing all right." Emily was taken aback by his kindness. I'm trying to be okay. It's just hard to move on from what happened." The Attorney General nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. It's not easy, but you have a chance now to learn from it and make sure it doesn't happen again. That's what matters." Emily looked up at him, feeling the weight of his words. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how fear can make us judge others without really understanding who they are. I think I've spent my life seeing the world in a way that wasn't entirely fair." He smiled warmly at her. "It takes a lot of courage to admit that. It's not easy to look at ourselves and realize that we've made mistakes, especially when those mistakes have consequences. But recognizing that is the first step toward change." "I don't know if I can fix everything," Emily said, her voice small. "I've let so many people down, my father, the community, and especially you." The Attorney General shook his head. "You don't need to fix everything all at once. What matters now is that you're thinking about how to be better. The important thing is not to stay stuck in guilt, but to learn and grow from it." There was a long pause before Emily spoke again, her voice more confident this time. "I don't know what will happen, but I want to do better. I want to make sure that I don't make the same mistake again." "That's all anyone can ask for," he replied gently. "Take it one step at a time. And remember, we all have biases and assumptions. The key is to confront them, to question them, and to be open to learning from each experience." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. The Attorney General's words had settled something inside her. She realized that while it might take time to repair the damage she had done, the process of understanding and growing was what mattered most. He had given her the opportunity to do better, and she wasn't going to waste it. As he turned to leave, he gave her one last piece of advice. "You have a chance to make a difference, Emily. Don't let this moment define you. Let it be the beginning of something better." With that, he walked away, leaving Emily standing in the park, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She didn't know exactly how things would unfold from here, but she knew that this conversation, this encounter, had marked a turning point for her. It was the first step in a new journey, a journey toward understanding, self-awareness, and hopefully, forgiveness. The following days seemed to stretch on forever for Emily, as if time had slowed down just for her. The weight of the incident with the Attorney General still lingered, but she was determined not to let it define her. She spent hours reflecting on her actions, thinking about the fear that had clouded her judgment and how quickly she had let it dictate her behavior. Slowly, she began to understand how deeply her fears and assumptions had shaped the way she viewed the world. It wasn't easy, but Emily began to talk to people. She started with her parents, who had always been supportive, but even they could tell that something was different. Emily's conversations with them were more open now, as she began to share the lessons she was learning. She had always been close to her father, but this time, it felt like their relationship was deepening in a new way. He listened patiently as she expressed her frustrations with herself, her struggle to understand her own actions. "You're learning," her father said one night as they sat together at the kitchen table. "That's what matters. We all make mistakes. What's important is how we move forward." Emily nodded, taking in his words. She had always admired her father's ability to stay calm under pressure, but now she was beginning to understand how his wisdom had shaped her growing up. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about understanding the impact of your actions and making sure that you learned from them. Her mother, on the other hand, took a more emotional approach. "You've got to be gentle with yourself, Emily," she said one afternoon as they cleaned up after lunch. "This is a hard lesson, but don't carry it with you forever. You have to let yourself grow." Emily knew her mother was right, but it wasn't always easy to forgive herself. Every time she saw the familiar faces around town, she could feel their eyes on her. She had become aware of how quickly people judged others, how they could form opinions based on nothing more than a fleeting moment. But now she understood that she, too, had been guilty of that very thing. It was a humbling realization. One afternoon, as Emily was walking to the park, she saw a familiar face, one of her neighbors, Mrs. Simmons. Mrs. Simmons had been friendly with Emily's parents for years, and Emily had known her since childhood. But today, when they greeted each other, Emily noticed something different. Mrs. Simmons' usual warm smile seemed a little colder, and she avoided looking Emily directly in the eyes. Emily felt a pang of guilt. She wondered if Mrs. Simmons had heard about the incident, and now saw her as the girl who had made a serious mistake. She tried to push the thought out of her mind, but couldn't help feeling the weight of her own actions. Later that evening, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. She thought about what had happened with Mrs. Simmons and other people she'd seen around town. She had learned something about herself, about the fear and assumptions that had shaped her actions. But now she was facing another challenge. How could she repair the damage she had done to her relationships with others? How could she rebuild their trust in her? Her thoughts were interrupted when she received a phone call. It was the Attorney General. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she picked up the phone. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. Emily, his voice was warm, steady, just like the first time they spoke. I wanted to check in with you. I know it's been a few days, and I just wanted to see how you were doing. His kindness took her by surprise, and for a moment, she was speechless. I'm doing better, she finally managed to say, feeling a mixture of gratitude and guilt. But I still can't stop thinking about what happened. You're still processing it, he replied. That's normal. But you're doing the right thing by reflecting and learning. Don't let the past weigh you down. Use it to move forward. His words were like a breath of fresh air, and for the first time in days, Emily felt a small sense of relief. She wasn't sure what to expect from the conversation, but she appreciated that he wasn't angry or resentful. Instead, he was encouraging her to learn and grow from her mistake, something that was starting to feel more like a lesson than an obstacle. Thank you, Emily said softly, for your understanding. It means a lot. I know it's not easy, he said, but just remember, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is how we handle them. After the call ended, Emily sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on everything he had said. The conversation had given her a renewed sense of clarity. She didn't have to be defined by her mistake. She could use it as a stepping stone to become a better person. The days following the phone call with the Attorney General brought some calm to Emily, but they also made her realize how much work was still ahead. It wasn't just about the town's perception of her, or even her own guilt. It was about understanding why she had acted the way she did, and making sure it didn't happen again. She found herself thinking a lot about the nature of fear, how it could cloud someone's judgment, how it could turn an innocent encounter into something more threatening in her mind. But now that she had reflected on it, she could see it more clearly. Fear wasn't just an external thing, it was something she had carried inside her all along. Despite her growing awareness, things were still awkward around town. Emily began to notice small changes in the way people looked at her. It wasn't just Mrs. Simmons. Others seemed to treat her with a kind of distance, not entirely unkind, but certainly not the same as before. She would catch glances, feel the weight of unspoken thoughts, and it made her heart heavy every time. The community had always felt like family to her, but now it felt like there was a wall between her and the people she had known her whole life. One day, after finishing her errands, Emily went to a local cafe. She sat by the window, watching the world pass by outside. It wasn't a bad day, but there was a sense of isolation she couldn't shake. Just as she was about to leave, she saw a familiar face enter the cafe. Her father. He was carrying a coffee cup in one hand, and his usual calm expression made him look like he hadn't noticed the tension that had been building around Emily. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice warm as he slid into the seat across from her. Emily smiled faintly, feeling both grateful and guilty. "Of course, Dad." For a while, they sat in comfortable silence. Her father wasn't one to push when she didn't want to talk, but today he seemed different. There was a certain softness to his gaze, like he was waiting for her to open up. "Emily," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "You've been carrying this around for days. I know it's hard, but you need to talk about it. Don't keep all this inside." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her thoughts bubbling up. I don't know how to make things right. I feel like everyone's watching me, and I don't know how to fix it. How do I get back to the way things were?" Her father's eyes softened, and he gave her a reassuring smile. "You don't fix everything all at once. This is a process. What matters is that you've learned something important. Not everyone gets that chance. You've done the hard work of realizing your mistakes, and that's the first step." "But it's not just about me, Dad," Emily replied, her voice shaking slightly. "I made a mistake that hurt someone else, and I've hurt the people I care about too." "I know," her father said gently, "but you're not the first person to make a mistake, and you won't be the last. The important thing now is how you make it right. It's not about going back to how things were. It's about moving forward, learning, and doing better. You're already on the right path." Emily looked at her father, feeling a mixture of gratitude and sadness. She wanted things to go back to normal, but she knew it wasn't that simple. The road ahead would be long, and there would be moments when she would feel the weight of her actions again. But she also understood that she couldn't let that stop her from growing. She had to embrace the discomfort, face the consequences, and move forward with her eyes open. The conversation with her father gave her a sense of peace. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was the reassurance she needed to hear. Emily realized that healing wasn't something that could be rushed. It took time, and it took effort, but it was something she could control. A few days later, she decided to visit the Attorney General again. She had been thinking about what he had said, about confronting her fears and biases. She wanted to thank him for his kindness and wisdom, but more than that, she wanted to show him that she was taking responsibility for her actions. She found him at a community event, standing near a booth with a group of local leaders. As soon as he saw her, he gave her a nod and a small smile, and Emily felt a mix of nerves and gratitude. She walked over to him, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Attorney General," she began, her voice steady but soft, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you said to me the other day. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realize now that I have a lot of work to do, not just with the people around me, but with myself." He gave her a thoughtful look, his gaze kind and understanding. "You're welcome, Emily. And remember, it's a process. You're doing well." His words felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't expect things to be perfect right away. But she was beginning to understand that growth wasn't about perfection. It was about trying, learning, and continuing to move forward. As she left the event, Emily felt a little lighter. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in days, she felt like she was on the right track. The road ahead might be uncertain, but she knew she had the strength to walk it. And with each step, she was learning to become a better person, not just for others, but for herself as well. As the weeks passed, Emily continued to navigate the complexities of her life after the incident. She had come to terms with the fact that her mistake had left a mark on her, but she was also starting to realize that this wasn't the end. It was merely a chapter in her journey, one that would teach her valuable lessons that would shape who she was becoming. She was determined to make things right, not just for others, but for herself too. The first step was acknowledging how deeply her fear and assumptions had impacted her. Every time she walked down the street or visited the local store, she could feel eyes on her, some curious, others judgmental. It wasn't easy to shake the feeling that people were whispering about her behind her back. But Emily had learned something important from the Attorney General's words. She couldn't let the mistakes define her. She had to move forward, no matter how difficult it seemed. One afternoon, Emily decided to take a walk through the town's main square, where she often saw familiar faces. The air was crisp, and the sun cast a golden glow over everything. She hoped the fresh air would help clear her thoughts. As she passed by a group of locals, she noticed a few of them glance her way. Instead of shrinking back, she stood tall and nodded politely, offering a small but genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small victory. She couldn't change how others felt about her, but she could control her own actions. Later that week, Emily decided to take the next step in her personal growth. She reached out to Mrs. Simmons, the neighbor who had treated her with coldness after the incident. Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she dialed the number, but she knew this was something she had to do. She couldn't allow the mistake to create an unspoken divide between them forever. When Mrs. Simmons answered, her voice was soft, but there was an underlying hesitation. "Emily, is everything okay?" "I just wanted to talk," Emily said, trying to steady her nerves. "I know things have been awkward between us, and I just want to say that I'm sorry for what happened. I made a mistake, and I realize now how my actions could have hurt you and others." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Mrs. Simmons spoke. "I appreciate you calling, Emily. It's not easy to admit when we've made a mistake, but I understand. We all have moments where we act out of fear, even if we don't mean to." Hearing Mrs. Simmons' understanding words made Emily's heart lift. The weight she had been carrying, the feeling that she would never be able to repair the damage, began to lift slightly. The conversation wasn't over yet, but it was a start. Emily knew that healing didn't happen overnight, but this felt like a significant step in the right direction. As the days went on, Emily felt herself growing stronger. She had learned that making amends wasn't always about grand gestures. It was about being patient, humble, and kind, both to others and to herself. Each day, she took small actions that moved her closer to the person she wanted to become. She was learning to listen more carefully, to understand the deeper layers of people's feelings, and to let go of the assumptions that had once controlled her. One evening, while sitting on her porch, Emily looked out at the town, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She realized that the road to growth was not always a straight path. It had its bumps and detours, but it was still a journey worth taking. The people she had hurt or disappointed weren't the only ones who needed healing. So did she. The work she had done on herself over the past weeks had been difficult, but it had brought her to a place of self-awareness that was priceless. Emily still didn't know how everything would unfold, but she had come to understand that the most important part of the process was learning to be better, one day at a time. She had learned that making mistakes didn't make her a bad person, and that the key to growth was acknowledging those mistakes, learning from them, and striving to do better. As she sat on the porch, Emily realized that, for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. Her journey wasn't finished, but she knew that she was on the right track. And that, she thought, was enough for now. She would keep moving forward, taking each lesson as it came, trusting that she was becoming the person she was meant to be. Emily had come a long way since that fateful afternoon when she made the mistake that had changed everything. The guilt and shame that once weighed heavily on her had slowly given way to a newfound understanding of herself and others. She had learned to face her fears and challenge the assumptions that had once governed her thoughts and actions. But now, as she sat on the porch one quiet evening, she realized there was still more to be done. The town felt a little different now. People still recognized her, but the coldness that had once surrounded her began to thaw. She still noticed some cautious glances, but there were more smiles, more waves, and more genuine interactions. The community had been through its own transformation, and so had Emily. It wasn't just her efforts to make amends that had changed the way others saw her. It was the way she carried herself now, confident, self-aware, and open to learning. She had learned that making mistakes was part of being human. The key was how you responded and grew from them. One afternoon, as she walked down Main Street, she saw Mrs. Simmons again. This time, when their eyes met, there was no hesitation. Mrs. Simmons smiled warmly, and Emily felt her heart lift. "How have you been, Emily?" she asked, her voice kind. "I've been good," Emily said, her smile sincere. "Thanks for asking." It was a simple exchange, but it felt like a breakthrough. Emily had been so afraid that people would never forgive her, that they would always remember her mistake. But here, in this quiet moment, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just something others could give her. It was something she had to give herself first. Later that week, Emily found herself sitting down with her father again. This time, it wasn't about the mistake. It was about the progress she had made. They were sitting in the same kitchen where they had had their difficult conversation weeks ago. But this time, it felt different. There was a lightness in the air that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," Emily began, stirring her coffee slowly, "about everything that's happened. And I think I've finally started to understand what it really means to grow." Her father nodded, watching her closely. "It's not always easy, is it?" "No," she said, shaking her head slightly. "But it's worth it. I've learned that mistakes don't define you. It's what you do after that matters. I've had to accept that it takes time to heal, and that healing is something that doesn't just happen in a moment." Her father smiled, proud of the progress she had made. "You've come a long way, Emily. I'm proud of you." Emily felt her heart swell with warmth. She had always looked up to her father, and hearing his approval meant more to her than she had realized. She had learned to be kinder to herself, to give herself the space to grow and improve, without the burden of shame holding her back. But there was one more thing Emily had to do. It was a small gesture, but one that meant a lot. She had written a letter to the Attorney General, thanking him for his wisdom and understanding. She wasn't expecting a response, but she felt it was important to express her gratitude. She wanted him to know that his words had made a difference, that they had helped her see the world in a new light. A few days later, to her surprise, she received a letter in return. It wasn't long, but it was enough. "Emily," it read, "I'm glad to hear that you're doing well. Remember, we all have the capacity for growth and change. Keep moving forward, and know that the road you're on is one worth walking." His words felt like a confirmation of everything she had been learning over the past few weeks. Emily smiled as she folded the letter and placed it carefully in her drawer. She had come full circle. The mistake she had made was still a part of her, but it no longer defined her. What defined her now was how she had chosen to learn from it, how she had faced her fears and insecurities, and how she had worked to become a better person. As she sat back in her chair, Emily looked out the window, watching the sun set over the town. It was a peaceful evening, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace with herself. There would be more challenges ahead, more lessons to learn, but for now, Emily knew she was ready. She had found the strength to move forward, and that was enough.